Brian Lord, a game where you play some lord named Brian off to collect elements to save his What? Oh. This is not, in fact, Brian Lord. This is Brain Lord, a game that is differentiated from the one I was thinking of, in that it's not on the N64, and that it's actually good. Now, the basic premise of this game is that your father went out to become a dragon warrior. However, he never came back. It's up to you to figure out what happened to him and try and become a dragon warrior yourself. This initial goal hints that you look to a nearby tower to scale to the top to try and find a dragon. And the story sort of unfolds from there. And while the basic premise is actually pretty bland and generally just kind of falls by the wayside, it's not really the plot that makes the story interesting, but rather the subplots interwoven and how they're delivered. For you see, you're not the only warrior going out to climb a tower and defeat a dragon. In actuality, there's about half a dozen of you, all trying to climb this tower, and you get to interact with them in each small town, as well as coming across them intermittently in each dungeon that you end up delving into. And slowly they end up helping you, as well as reveal more about their own backstory and why they're doing what they're doing. And that, I found, was far more interesting than the basic plot of the game, which is just kind of a simple adventure story. Now, the gameplay in and of itself is a fairly simplistic dungeon crawler. Essentially, you start out in a town, you have to make your way to the dungeon, and then navigate several floors of traps, monsters, bosses, and secrets in order to complete the dungeon. Now, this game heavily focuses on the dungeons, and is very much about exploring each one and navigating each trap. And it does so intelligently. Each dungeon will start off by presenting you a basic problem, like needing to weigh down a switch with a rock. And then it might present to you a basic trap, like a boulder that if you stand in front of will start chasing you in a straight line. And eventually you have to combine pushing rocks with these trap boulders in order to weigh several switches so that you can successfully navigate a room. Later then it gets compiled with monsters, and so on and so on. So the way they've set up understanding all the different mechanics of each dungeon was done in a very intelligent manner, isolating each individual problem, and then later, once you've gotten used to the basic problems, combining them into more complex problems that you already understand the basics of. This makes the learning curve for the puzzles very smooth, while still maintaining challenge later on. Each dungeon is also incredibly massive, usually taking 2 or 3 hours each, and are chock full of secrets and collectibles, some of which you can only obtain later in the game. For one example, there was a room in the first dungeon which was hidden by a wall. There was nothing about this wall that looked any different, and in fact it was behind a chest, so you wouldn't even think to look there, unless you used the X-ray scopes, which I found a little bit finicky, so I never bothered. But once you went up to this wall, you could start pushing it and open it. And then you managed to get a health and magic power-up, as well as an artifact that essentially doubled your money. I didn't find this room until my third playthrough of this game, and I actually remembered that this particular secret was hinted at earlier in the story, and I just thought it was referring to something else entirely. So basically, there are tons of secrets in this game that you really have to think about and pay attention to every bit of material you're given, from the writing on the walls to simply talking to your other adventurers. Now, combat is a standard action RPG style. You know, you walk around, you smack people with your sword, you move on. But it's a lot more deep than that. Instead of just your sword, there are several different weapons you can get, some of which you can buy, most of which you have to actually find, like a boomerang, or an axe, a sword, a bow, a flail, and the neat thing about them is they all behave differently. So sure, the axe might do more damage than your sword, but it's very hard to hit with. The bow has a lot more range, but it doesn't necessarily do as much damage as the flail, which might not have as much range as the bow, but does a lot more damage. In exchange, it's a lot more awkward to hit with. Because of this, there's no real one optimum weapon, and you really have to adjust your style for each weapon you get. In addition, there are also shields which you can use to deflect attacks with. But these have a durability meter, and they're the only piece of equipment in this game to have such a feature. It's not one I'm rather fond of, but it means that you have to constantly be buying new shields or be really smart with how you use it and when. So maybe you won't necessarily try and deflect an attack from an opponent, instead you'll try to sidestep it, because you can't go crazy with your blocking with your shield because it will break, and that's not good, especially when there are moments when you will need it. Now, the one key thing that makes combat really unique in Brainlord are jades. Simply put, jades are crystals that contain a summon. In fact, once you obtain a jade, you get to name your summon. It's a little bit annoying that you don't get to see what your summon will look like beforehand. If you think that you could give it a more appropriate name, you're kinda stuck with it. Once you have your jade, you can select it and equip it to your character. In fact, you can equip two at once, and it will summon a sort of fairy to fly around you. Depending on which jade you have will ultimately change its effect. There are passive ones that will raise your defense. There are some that will help you navigate traps in a dungeon. There's even some that will do all the attacking for you. And these jades have tons of combinations. But that's not all there is to jades. For you see, if you're the kind of person who enjoys power leveling in games, you can't really do that in Brainlord, because there are no character levels. The only leveling done is with jades. But the coolest thing, the absolute coolest thing about this, they visibly upgrade themselves. It's a little bit more subtle with some than others, but as your jade levels up, they will visibly become stronger. They will prove to be more effective, and it's a good indicator to show that you're getting better and advancing. Or, at the very least, your little Jade Guardians are getting a lot more badass to cover you. That's great, I love this. More games need to have visual upgrades. The soundtrack is fairly average. It's not wildly memorable, but it is pretty fitting. And the sound effects are fairly stock as well. The aesthetic is bright and colorful, and there's a few really nice touches, such as having a layer of clouds hover over some of the overworld. My only real problem with how this game looks is that some of the characters look bland, and I don't understand why the main character, the hero of the tale, mind you, looks exactly like the generic city guard guys, with the only difference being the shoulder color. But I think both of the sound design and the visual design of this game helps to refocus on this game's greatest strength, which is the dungeon crawling. While it might not sound the most spectacular or look the best, it has some of the most solid dungeon crawling I've played on this system. Some of the most intelligent trap design, and because the dungeon crawling is so satisfying, I kind of find it a bit of a shame that there's only about half a dozen dungeons. Granted, of these dungeons, they cover a wide variety of different styles. Classic dungeon, futuristic spaceship, ice dungeon, fire dungeon, that sort of thing. And they're very long, I just wish there was more of them. And in the end, I guess that's the biggest compliment I can give this game. It's a ton of fun, and I suppose the most fortunate thing about this game is the fact is it's not wildly expensive. So if you want some solid dungeon crawling, and you want a new action RPG, and you happen to have burned through your copy of Illusion of Gaia one too many times, pick up Brainlord.